Hi, I just want to go over the steps in creating something like this knob for something like a microscope using Displacement Map. So this is a good example of how to use textures in place of modeling to add detail like these raised edges. This is based on a tutorial by Arvid Schneider on YouTube, but I just want to quickly go through this. So what we're trying to achieve is taking a simple cylinder and just adding these protrusions. Now these could be done with extrusions if you actually wanted to model, but doing it with displacement gives you some flexibility to change the look over time. So let me just pause this and move it out of the way. So we're starting with a simple cylinder like this. I'm going to hide it, create a cylinder, make it a bit shorter. Let's move it up a little bit. I'm going to give it some more divisions along its height, and then just a few more along its axis so we get kind of square shaped polygons here, just so it has some room to work with. And we're not going to worry about the top too much because we're going to not have the texture go there. Okay, so that is all the modeling we're going to do, save for one more step later, but we'll get to that. So if I right click on the object and go down to assign new material, we're going to use an AI standard surface. Delete the history on this model. And let's make this one just a different color so it's clear and I'm dealing with a different model here. Okay, so we'll start with this, and we need the hypershade to create this network. And so if you want to see the network that I created before, you can see it here. So it's not that complicated. Just to run you through it and then we'll build it. We have the shader, which is hooked up to the shading group, which links the shader to the geometry in the scene to which it's applied, to lighting in the scene and other render settings. So to the shading group, we have this sort of chain of ramps that are making this kind of pattern here, the tooth pattern. It's going into a displacement shader. This goes into the shading group for our shader. And then we have a slight bump that's just breaking up the surface a little bit. So this is also a way to show the difference between what a displacement is and what a bump is in Maya. Okay, so let's build this thing ourselves. So we're starting with this. And the first thing we're going to do is create a ramp. So just hitting tab, typing in ramp. There are a number of different things with ramp in it. The one that we want is ramp texture. It's the simplest setup. It relies on the UVs of the model. So rather than something that's projected onto the model or something that's using a stencil to cut out part of the image. So we're going to take this ramp and have it create that toothed pattern running in this direction. So we want the ramp to be oriented in this way, so up and down. If I select the ramp, so what we're going to do is put a white color in the middle, black color approaching it, and then click in the field over here to make another color entry, and we're going to turn this one black as well. So this one we want to be right in the middle. I'll make it 0.5. Let's say I'll make this one 0.6. This one we'll make 0.4. So that's just the relative position in the U direction. Oh, sorry, this is, by default it's a V ramp. We want to make this a U ramp. And so why do we want to do that? Well, we can tell if we select the model and go to the UV editor. And this is how the UVs are laid out. So I'm just going to move it to the side here a bit. So you can see the caps are laid out here, and then the barrel of the cylinder is laid out here. And you can see the seam of the cylinder, which is this edge and this edge here. So running along what you would normally think of as the x-axis in a Cartesian space like this, this is U, the U value, and going up and down, which you normally think of as y, is the v direction. So it's like longitude, latitude. So we want those teeth to be running this way. So we want it running along the u direction. Okay. And so this, you can see that the barrel is compressed into this small area here. We can take advantage of the full width of the U region, so spreading out this whole circumference along the side into this area. So we just right click and go to UV and double click on this. This is a shell, so it's actually separate from the top and the bottom, not in the model but just in UV space. And I can scale this out just to fill this space up here. But just one thing to take note of, and we're going to take advantage of this in a bit, is that the barrel part has its upper and lower limits defined by a V value, right? So here it's around 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, around 0.3 is the bottom, so that's where this edge is. And then 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, around 0.7, that's where this edge is between the top cap and the top here. And so if we want those teeth not to go into the top and bottom cap, we can take advantage of this UV layout. All right. Okay, good. So what we're going to do is we're going to do sort of an unfinished version where we don't take into consideration the cap at first, and then we'll fix it with a second ramp. So you can see that this ramp is defining one tooth. So no bump, or sorry, no displacement in the black area. So black equals 0. And full displacement in the white area. White equals 1. But we want more than one tooth, right? So we can go into the hypershade, and we have the ramp that is linked to the place 2D texture node. And it has a bunch of settings. And one of the settings down here are repeat UV. And so you've got two columns here for this. So the first column is U, the second column is V. And because this is a U ramp, we're going to repeat UV, let's say 20 times. And now if we go to the ramp, you can see that this pattern is repeated 20 times. Okay, so now let's turn this into a displacement map. And I'm going to do things not wrong, but sort of out of step, and show you how this is built as we go. So the common setup for a displacement map is taking some color value from the texture, in this case the ramp, and linking it to the displacement shader attribute of the shading group, which is linked to the shader. Okay? So you could use out alpha, which is a black and white value of this ramp. You can't use out color because out color is a 3-channel attribute, and displacement shader attribute only wants a single channel. So the way that I'll typically do it is take out color R, and I would link it to that, but not directly. We need an intervening node here. And one of the reasons I use out color R is because if you're bringing in a file from, or a displacement map from ZBrush, I believe ZBrush writes the displacement information in the R channel. So it's just a handy thing to get used to. And because this is a black and white image, out color R, out color G, and out color B are all equal values anyway. So we can just use one of these. But the intervening node that we need is one called displacement shader. So just in the time-honored tradition of calling different things by the same name, you can see in the standard surface shading group that's linked to our shader that's on the object, there is a node, there is an attribute called displacement shader, but there's also a node called displacement shader, which has its own shading group. In this case, we don't need this new shading group that's created, so we're just going to delete that. So now what we can do is take out color R from our ramp and link it to displacement in the displacement shader. And then we can take the out from the displacement shader node and hook it up to the displacement shader attribute in the AI standard surface shading group, SG for shading group. If you don't see this green dot beside displacement, you can click on this bigger green dot and you can choose, normally displacement would show up here in this list, or you can say other and you can grab this list and you can see displacement is listed here. But it should show up. So we've actually now created our displacement shader. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do render, but of course I'm going to save my file first. So let's just close this for a second and let's just see what we've got going on here. So now if I just open the Arnold render view, which I already have open somewhere. There we go. And render. Okay, so you can see that something is happening here. It's being displaced. So it's actually changing the geometry, but not in a good way. And so you can maybe imagine what's happening here. There's very little geometry for it to work with, right? So it's trying to make these things jut out, but there's not that much geometry to work with here. So we actually have to smooth the model a little bit more. I'm going to stop my shade in my renderer. So if I select the geometry, so because the displacement, unlike other shading options, actually changes the geometry, we have to select the geometry and go into its shape node, and under Arnold there are a few settings we have to change. So Arnold, we'll go down to Subdivision. So Subdivision, you can turn this on to Cat Clark, so that's just a method of smoothing geometry. And so what this does is it only smooths the geometry at render time when you click the render button. And so that means you can have a low resolution object in your scene, and then if it has a displacement on it, it will smooth it at render time and give you better results. So I'm going to turn this up to, let's say, 4. And let's render now and see what happens. I'm going to save my scene. Okay, so at least something different is happening, right? So it looks like these kind of fins are coming out, but they're being clipped off in this sort of square shape, which is weird, right? So let's see how we fix that. So under Subdivision, back in the shape node, under Subdivision we have a thing called Displacement Attributes. If we open that up, we can change the overall height. So that's how far these are going to push out. And this is based on units in the scene, right? So there's 1 unit here. So you can see it looks like it's trying to achieve 1 unit. Now there are other multipliers of this elsewhere, but right now they're set to 1 as well. So we should get 1 to 1. So I turn this down to 0.1. Right, so now we're getting something a little better. The top part is weird. We're going to fix that later. Just ignore that. Still poking out maybe a little bit too far. Okay, so that's not bad. So it's kind of interesting. This is, making these ridges. There's maybe too much space in between them, but this is the value of doing this procedurally using something like a ramp, because I can, if I just put this over here, if I go in and select this ramp, let's make sure you can see this on screen. And if I adjust this ramp, if I pull out, its sides like this, I can change the nature of that bump. So you can imagine this white point here is the peak, and then it's going down to black here. So it's kind of peaking sharply. So one thing we can do is change in the ramp. It's a U ramp, and the interpolation between colors is linear. Just each pixel is the same value change going from one color to another. We can change this to smooth. Now we'll get a smoother gradation between these. We can tighten them up if we want to make them sharper but smooth, right? There's another one called bump. Don't mistake this with bump mapping. It's just the interpolation between these points. So it's kind of smooth in the middle and sharp on the edges. So that's kind of interesting. And also, it's not quite enough of these. I want more repetitions of this. So I'm working in my ramp right now, but if I go to the Place 2D Texture node, I can change the repeat UVs to 60 or something. And it's starting to get a little better. I'm actually going to loosen this up So I'm just loosening up the ramp. And maybe I don't want it to be bump. Maybe I do want it to be smooth. And maybe I want it to have a bit of a plateau in the middle, so it just doesn't come up to one sort of zenith of displacement. So if I want to add another color, I just click in here, change it to white. Just dragging it over to either end will go to white or to black. And so I can spread these out a little bit. And this is kind of more of what I want, you know, so it's a thumb wheel or something, so you want nice grip on this. So I'm pretty happy with that. So you can see that you can manipulate the nature of the ramp to give this flat area of black. So these link at either end, obviously, because this is repeated. So that's the black area in here. And then climbing the slope up to the top of the displacement is this black to white area. And then the top of this displacement is this white region here. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'm happy with that, so I'm going to leave it. I'm going to save my file. I'm going to actually stop my rendering first. Save my scene. Now I want to do something to solve this problem. The cap is all, we don't want it to displace at the cap. We want the displacement to stop at the edge here, right? So to do that, we're going to actually make another ramp. And let's have a little reminder of what the UV map of this thing looks like. Right, so remember 0.3, 0.7, I think, in the V direction. So if our texture, this ramp over here, if these lines end at the 0.7, this is a representation of the UV space. If these lines end here and end here, that's going to block them from going onto the cap. So we just want to make these regions black and just reveal the black and white lines in the middle. And we can do that with another ramp. Okay, so let's do this. So I'm going to break the connection, so between the ramp and the displacement shader for now. And I'm going to create a new ramp, tab, ramp, choose ramp texture. And this one is going to be a V ramp. Remember, the first one is a U ramp, so it's going along the U direction. This one we want to run up and down in UV space, so we're going to use a V ramp. And remember, we said at around 0.3, we want it to be black up to that point. And then around, I'll put in another color field, 0.7, we want it to also be black. Okay, so it's going to be black in the middle, so we'll just grab this white one and move it over. Okay, so but we don't want it to be white in the middle. We want those black and white stripes to show up here. So I'm going to make another field in here to help define this white region. But now I'm going to link that original ramp into these middle color fields. Okay, so I'm going to select this white one. I'm going to middle mouse drag the original ramp onto the selected color. So now you can see it's made a link, and you can see that those stripes are coming in here, but then they fade to white over here because this field is still white. So I'm going to select this field, and then middle mouse drag the original ramp into its selected color, and now we have those stripes appearing inside a ramp. So we've got a pair of nested ramps, right? So now they're not connected to anything. So let's just rename these so it's a little easier to see. So this is the U ramp stripes, and this one we'll call the V ramp cap mask. Right, so those black areas are saying don't displace anything, and this is the area where the caps are in the UV map. Okay, so now we have to take the VRamp cap mask and take the out color R and just hook that back up to displacement, and then the rest of the chain is still working. So let's see if this works. Let's cross our fingers. We'll save the file. And do I have my render view open? Nope. So we'll go to Arnold, render view, and hope it doesn't crash. Uh-oh, it's thinking pretty hard. Oh, there we go. So you can see what's happening. So now we've got these things kind of going up to the edge. And here's one of the real benefits, again, of using a procedural method, using a ramp that can be adjusted after the fact, is how if I select the V ramp cap mask, sorry, I'm going to move it over. If I don't want it to creep up onto the top, then I can take, so this is the 0.6 and, or 0.7. Oh, maybe it was supposed to be 0.7. Oh, it is 0.7. But I can pull these in a little bit tighter, right? You can see it's kind of eroding it down the side. And then we might want to match the bottom to be like that too. And we could do this numerically to make it more precise, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. Okay, so that's pretty good. Now you can see that on the top, because of the nature of the geometry that's all going towards one point, it kind of makes sort of ugly geometry. And there you can kind of see the pinching. But it also, we don't have that much control over this edge. So this is the last modeling that you might want to do. It's pretty simple, but we could just bevel the edges around here. So this edge up here, so let me get rid of my hypershade. So if I go into edge mode and just double click on one of these edges around here, and the bottom too, so we'll grab these two edge loops going around, go to the modeling toolkit, and I know there are shortcuts for all these things, but just so you can see, change the fraction to maybe 0.1, give it a couple of segments, and let's see. Render this again. We'll save the scene. Okay, so now we've got more control over the edge, and we've added more geometry, so we might have to adjust our ramp a little bit. I'll just open that in the attribute editor. And the top ramp, maybe I just wanted to creep up to that edge a little more closely. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. Sometimes you get these little areas where it's pinching over. I'm not sure why. It's probably on the seam or something. So we might just want to dial that back a little bit. Dial that back. It's a joke. Okay, so something like that. Then we'll do the same thing down at the bottom. So that's pretty good. One thing I didn't mention, because it didn't really come up after, but you can take, and let me just demonstrate what's going on, what I mean. So I'm going to break it for a second. I'm going to save the scene. So if I select the shape node of this object, remember we have subdivisions, and I set it to 4. If you're not getting enough detail, you might have turned this up to 5, but you spend more render time on this. But here under Displacement Attributes, I changed this to a really low height value. So 0.025. If I go back up to 1, you see this thing happening where it's trying to displace out, and it kind of reaches this artificial boundary and it clamps off. That's what the bounds padding is. So this is a way to clamp off so it doesn't exceed a certain displacement. So if that's happening and you need it to be really displacing that amount, just turn the bounds padding up to something that will not stop it from doing this. So if you needed to make this kind of flywheel or like a cooling fan or I don't know, something like that, then you could displace this much. You see some weird stuff going on here. That's why you get that kind of clipping sometimes. I'm going to go back to my small value. So let's just look at a couple of other things here that you might want to change. This is a little longer than I thought it was going to be. If we go back to the V-ramp cap mask, remember I didn't change the interpolation here at all, so we get this kind of linear fall off between these two colors. I can change that if I want to smooth. Then we'll get a smoother fall off or bump. And so you can see it's just changing the nature of this transition between the two color fields. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do is add a bump to my model. So a displacement actually changes the geometry. A bump map really just perturbs the surface normals, right? So if we just go, and you don't need to do this, this is just for demonstration under display, polygons, face normals. You can see that there are normals pointing out, and this is how Maya figures out what to do with light that strikes the surface, measuring, you know, the angle of incidence of light and the angle of reflection or refraction. And so Maya can take advantage of this by tricking the model by using a texture to sort of wiggle around these normals, and it'll make the surface appear bumpy, but it doesn't change the overall shape of the object in any way. Let me just turn that off. So to do this, we are going to go back to our shader. Let me just get in here a bit closer. So here's all of our displacement stuff here. Let's just move it out of the way because this is a whole other thing. And we're going to create a new texture, tab, and we'll use AI noise. So this is an Arnold texture that is pretty flexible. There are lots of other textures. So up here you've got the Maya 2D textures, and there are fractals and noise and things like that. 3D textures, Brownian, solid fractal, different types of noises. But the Arnold AI noise is pretty flexible and easy to use. So we want to hook this up ultimately to this thing called normal camera. But you can't just hook up, you know, the outcolor R to the normal camera. It's not going to work, or the outcolor to the normal camera. There has to be an intervening node here to make it work as a bump map. And the easiest way to set this up, and let me just shift this over here, if I select my shader and just scroll down to this area called geometry, and you see there's a field called bump mapping. Now you have to be very kind of careful where you make this connection, but if you take the, so keep this open by keeping this selected, and then the AI noise, if you middle mouse click on it and drag it over to the words bump mapping, not to the field beside it, but to the words bump mapping. It won't work if you drag it to the field. It'll do something, but it won't do the right thing. So if you hook it up to bump mapping, so it will make a connection, but it wants to know what you want to hook up. And we want to hook up the out color to the bump value. So if I click on out color, you can see bump value is now grayed out. Again, bump value is a single channel attribute. Out color is a triple channel attribute. So you can just choose out color R again and hook that up to bump value. And the little thing that it does here is it puts this intervening node called a bump 2D node. This is my second one, so there's another 2 there. And so this tells the shader to use this as a bump. And so if we just render now, you can see what it's doing. And you can see it also hooked up to normal camera, even though we were dragging it onto something called bump mapping. And remember what I said about normals? It's hooking it up to the relationship between the camera normal and the surface normals of this object. So if I just do a render now you can see this kind of big kind of bump on it. So we can change this. So I'll just leave it big like this, so it's going to look ugly for a bit. And just while we're on the topic, a really handy thing is this button here in the Arnold render view. It's called Isolate Select. If you click on that, then it just shows you the results of this one, whatever node you have selected. So if I have the noise selected, then I can see it without all the other rendering. So it's quick to render and it shows you the results quickly. So if we look in the select, sorry, that's off screen. So we have the AI noise selected, we see it here, and here it is open in the attribute editor. So we can choose the coordinate space that we want it to be in. We can change it to pref so it acts like a 3D texture. And then we want to change the scale. So if we increase the scale, it makes the details smaller. So if we go to scale 6, 6, 6, I'm just hitting tab in between. you can see it makes smaller details. Now if I turn off isolate select, you can see it's making it bump like this. So again, it's not actually changing the shape of the object, it's just adding bump detail. So this is too bumpy. So in the bump 2D node here, we can select this. And bump value is taking the black and white information from that noise node. And the depth is our sort of volume dial. So I can turn this to a low value, so we're just not getting as much of it. We could even make it a lower value. And we can just adjust the scale a little more. So maybe we want a smaller scale bump just to break up the surface. Now this is too bumpy, so we can make this even smaller. Right, so this is so small that you almost don't see it, but if I move it in the light, you can see how it's just breaking up the light a little bit. So it's not a perfectly smooth surface. You can see a little bit of that bump there. So it's a subtle detail to add, and you might even want to just put it on the top and not on the sides here, or you might want to continue to change this to make it a finer bump. Or you can even use one of the other noises. So this is, so we just look at it here, we can just see a little bit of that bump. And so as the light's moving over the surface, we'll see just very faintly that bump. I can turn up the value maybe a little bit. Sorry, not the value, the bump depth. Yeah, so now you can just see it. Maybe that's even a little bit too much, but you get the idea. And of course, because we have, this is a shader, if we think it's too shiny, you know, we can turn down the specularity a little bit, or we can turn up its roughness just to roughen it up a bit. So whatever we want to do, we can make it look more like a plastic by giving it a little bit of subsurface color. We'd have to adjust according to the scale of this object, you know, just to make it look a little bit translucent. Anyway, you can, that's something you can play around with. But all of this can still be adjusted in our shader if we decide, well, it actually needs more teeth. We can still go all the way back to our original ramp and change it from repeat UV and 60 to, I don't know, we can change it to 90. And now we just get a lot more teeth. And if you modeled this in, then you're kind of stuck with it, the modeling, rather than using a displacement material like this. So anyway, this 10-minute video turned into a half-hour video. I'm sorry. But I hope you find this useful. And again, thanks to Arvid Schneider for inspiring this idea.